She stood at the edge of town with nothing but a worn leather bag, a belly full of life, and eyes that had already forgotten how to ask for help. Nobody offered her a seat in the general store. Nobody held the door. A woman at the dry goods counter whispered something to her friend, and they both looked over with that particular kind of pity that feels worse than cruelty, the kind that says, "We see you, and we're glad we're not you." Her name was Clara Hensley, widow, 29 years old, 7 months along, and not a single soul in Dry Creek, Texas willing to give her a chance. She had come here because her late husband, Thomas, had spoken of it once, said it was a good town, a honest town, said if anything ever happened to him, she should go to his cousin Raymond. Raymond would help. Raymond was family. Raymond had taken one look at her swollen belly, then at his wife standing stiff-backed in the kitchen doorway and said, "We don't have the room." They had 4 empty bedrooms. Clara had counted the windows from outside, so here she was, standing in the afternoon dust, trying to remember what hope felt like, and coming up mostly empty. If this kind of story speaks to your heart, stay right here, because what happens next in Clara's life is going to remind you that sometimes the person who saves you isn't the one you expected, and sometimes the quietest kind of love is the loudest kind of healing. Subscribe if you're new, and let's go back to Dry Creek, because a man is about to ride in, and nothing is going to be the same after that. She found a bench outside the feed store and sat down slowly, one hand on her back, the other resting on her belly, as if protecting the only thing in the world that still needed her. The sun was going down over the flat Texas land, painting the sky in shades of rust and amber, and Clara watched it the way a person watches something beautiful when they're too tired to feel it. That's when she heard the horse, not the sound of a horse passing through, the sound of a horse stopping. She didn't look up right away. She had learned not to look up because looking up meant hoping, and hoping had cost her too much lately. But then a shadow fell over her, and a voice, low and unhurried, said, "You look like you've been sitting there a while." She looked up then. He was tall, the way men out here were built tall, like the land itself had grown them. Dusty hat, worn coat, jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. But it was his eyes that stopped her, dark brown, steady, and carrying a kind of sadness that recognized her own. "I'm fine," she said, "because that's what you say when you're not." He didn't argue with her, didn't push, just looked at the bench, then at the empty street, then back at her. "There a place you're headed tonight?" he asked. She opened her mouth to say yes. The word didn't come. He nodded once, like her silence told him everything he needed to know, and he didn't make her feel ashamed for it. "Name's Eli Cade," he said. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles out. It's not much, but there's a room and there's supper, and you're welcome to both if you need them." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had been taught, same as every woman her age, to be careful, to be cautious, to not trust a stranger offering something for nothing. But she was 7 months pregnant, alone on a bench in a town that didn't want her, and the sun was nearly gone. "Why?" she asked. He thought about it, genuinely thought about it, like the question deserved a real answer. "My wife passed 2 years ago," he said quietly. "There were days nobody offered her a hand either. I always thought that was wrong." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. Then she picked up her bag. "I'm Clara," she said. "I know," he said. "You were married to Thomas Hensley. He was a decent man. I'm sorry for your loss." She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected anyone in this town to say that, let alone mean it. She followed him to his wagon, and he helped her up without making it a production, just a steady hand offered and accepted, and they rode out toward the flat, open land as the last light disappeared behind the hills. The ranch was called Cade's Rest, and it looked exactly like its name. Weathered wood, a porch that sagged slightly on one side, 2 horses in the paddock, a barn that leaned a little, but stood. A boy of about 8 was sitting on the porch steps when they pulled up, and he looked at Clara with the wide-open stare that only children and very honest people manage. "Pa," the boy said, "you brought someone home." "I did," Eli said. "This is Mrs. Hensley. She's going to stay with us for a while. You'll treat her with respect." The boy stood up and extended his hand like a small businessman. "I'm Jacob," he said. "We've got a good room. I swept it last week." Clara shook his hand. Something in her chest, which had been clenched tight for weeks, loosened just a little. Inside, Eli had already started a pot of beans that morning, and the kitchen smelled like warmth. He set a place at the table for her without asking if she was hungry, because he'd clearly learned that people who say they're fine often aren't, and people who say they're not hungry usually are. Jacob talked through most of supper, about the horses, about a snake he'd found near the water trough, about how his teacher in town said he was good at reading but not at sitting still. Clara listened and found herself answering, and then asking questions. And before she realized it, an hour had passed and her shoulders were somewhere near her normal height instead of up around her ears. After supper, Eli showed her the room. Clean, simple, a quilt on the bed that had been made by careful hands. A window that looked out over the dark open land. Wash basins down the hall, he said. Jacob's room is next to yours if you need anything in the night. I'm at the end of the hall. You need help, you call. Mr. Cade, she said, why are you really doing this? He stood in the doorway for a moment. Because it's right, he said. Sleep well, Mrs. Hensley. He closed the door gently, and Clara sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself cry. Not from sadness this time, from something harder to name. The days settled into a rhythm, the way days do when the people sharing space are careful with each other. Clara helped where she could. She wasn't a woman who sat still well, and she told Eli plainly that she expected to earn her keep, not be a charity case. He didn't argue. He just nodded and let her set the table and help with breakfast and organize the pantry, which, by her assessment, had last been organized never. Jacob followed her around the kitchen like a small, earnest shadow. He asked her questions about where she was from, what the baby would be named, whether babies could hear things before they were born, whether she thought his father was sad, whether she thought the ranch would be okay. That last question stopped her. What do you mean, okay? She asked. Jacob looked at his boots. People in town say we're going to lose it, he said. Because of the money Pa owes on the second parcel. He doesn't talk about it, but I hear things. Clara didn't respond right away, but she filed it away. That evening, she found Eli on the porch after Jacob was in bed. He was looking out at the land the way men look at things they're afraid of losing, like they're memorizing it. She sat in the other chair and said, Jacob told me. He was quiet for a moment. Boy hears too much, he said, but not unkindly. Is it true? The second parcel? He nodded slowly. Banknote comes due in 6 weeks. I've been trying to pull together enough from the cattle sale, but it's not going to be enough. Not by a fair stretch. Clara looked out at the dark land. Is there anything that can be done? Not that I've found, he said. They sat in silence for a while. It was comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. I had a small savings, Clara said carefully. Thomas left a little, not much, but some. I was holding it for the baby. No, Eli said immediately. I didn't finish. You didn't need to. No. She looked at him. You took me in without being asked. You fed me, gave me a room, let me breathe when I couldn't figure out how to do it on my own. Let me at least help figure out a solution, even if the money isn't the answer. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly. More like recognition. You're stubborn, he said. Thomas said the same thing, she replied. He meant it as a compliment. Eli almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to one. It suited him. They talked until late that night, about the ranch, about the land, about what options might exist, about an uncle of Eli's who might buy a portion of the herd early, about whether the bank might extend the note if approached carefully. It wasn't a solution by the end of the evening, but it was a beginning, and beginnings Clara had learned were everything. A week later, the baby started coming early. It was 3 in the morning when Clara woke to the first sharp pain, and she lay still for a moment telling herself it wasn't what it was, the way people do when the truth is inconvenient. But the second pain arrived with the kind of conviction that doesn't leave room for argument. She made it to the hallway before she had to hold the wall. Eli's door opened. She didn't know how he'd heard. She hadn't made a sound. But he was there, fully awake in the way men are when they've trained themselves to sleep light, and he took one look at her and said, Okay, I've got you. He got her back to her room, sent Jacob on the horse to fetch the midwife from town with instructions that were calm and clear, and then he sat beside Clara's bed and held her hand and talked to her. Not about anything important. About the horses. About how the east pasture looked in the spring. About a funny thing Jacob had said at breakfast 2 days ago. He just talked, steady and low, so she had something to hold on to that wasn't the pain. The midwife arrived in time. Clara labored for 4 hours, and Eli stayed just outside the door the entire time because she had asked him not to leave, and he hadn't. When the cry came, small and furious and perfect, Clara heard him exhale from the hallway. A long, slow exhale, like he'd been holding his breath the whole time. The midwife opened the door and told him it was a girl, that both were well. Jacob, who had apparently not gone back to sleep, let out a whoop from somewhere down the hall that made Clara laugh in spite of everything. Eli appeared in the doorway, and Clara looked up at him from the bed, holding her daughter wrapped in the quilt that careful hands had made, and she said, "Come meet her." He came and stood by the bed and looked at the baby, the way people look at something they weren't expecting to need. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. "Hope," Clara said. "I think it suits her." He nodded. It does, he said. And then Jacob appeared at the door in his nightshirt, hair sideways, eyes shining, and said, "Can I see? Is she small? Pa, is she small like a rabbit?" Eli put a hand on his son's shoulder. "She's small like a person," he said. "Can I hold her?" Clara looked at Jacob's earnest face and said, "Tomorrow. Tonight she needs to sleep." Jacob nodded solemnly. "I'll be very quiet," he said, and then he crept back to his room with exaggerated softness that was loud enough to wake the horses. Eli looked back at Clara, and there was something in his eyes she recognized now. It was the same thing she felt when she looked at him. Something cautious and warm and slightly terrified. "Get some rest," he said softly. "Both of you." "Eli," she said before he reached the door. He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He stood there a moment, and then he said, "Get some rest, Clara." And the way he said her name, not Mrs. Hensley, just Clara, felt like a door that had been closed for a long time slowly swinging open. The trouble came from Raymond. She should have known it would. Men like Raymond didn't let things go, not when there was something to gain. Thomas's land back east, a small parcel but with good water rights, was technically part of the Hensley estate, and Raymond had decided that a widow living on another man's property was evidence enough that she had no claim to it. He rode out to Cade's Rest on a gray Thursday morning with a man in a suit and a piece of paper, and he stood on the porch telling Eli that Clara was a woman of questionable character and that the land should rightfully revert to the family. Clara heard it from inside. She stood at the kitchen window with Hope against her shoulder and listened to Raymond's smooth, confident voice laying out his case, and she felt the old cold feeling start to creep back up. Then she heard Eli. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. But it went very quiet and very still, the way the air goes still before a storm. "You're standing on my land," Eli said, "talking about a woman I respect. I'd like you to be very sure about what you say next." Raymond sputtered something about the law. "The law," Eli said, "says a widow has rights to her husband's estate. You know that. This man with you knows that. That paper in his hand doesn't change it. What it tells me is that you drove 4 miles on a Thursday morning to try to intimidate a woman who just had a baby, and I find that a particularly poor use of your time." There was a silence. "She's nothing to you," Raymond said. "She's a guest on my property," Eli said, "which makes her my concern. I'd suggest you leave, Raymond, before this conversation becomes something you'll need to explain to more people than just me." Raymond and the suited man left. Clara stood in the kitchen and realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear this time, from something else. From the feeling of being defended by someone who didn't have to defend her, who gained nothing from it, who did it simply because she was there and it was right. She was sitting on the porch with Hope when Eli came back inside. He didn't make a speech about it. He just poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and said, "I've been thinking we should talk to the lawyer in town about your land claim. Make it solid before Raymond gets any more ideas." "Eli," she said. Why do you keep doing that?" He looked at her. "Doing what?" "Standing up for me, like it's nothing." He set his cup down. He looked at her for a long moment, with that quiet look he had, the one that said more than most people's speeches. "It's not nothing," he said. "It's just what you do for people who matter." The words landed somewhere deep in Clara's chest and stayed there. The note on the second parcel was resolved 3 weeks later, not through Clara's savings, which Eli refused to touch, but through a combination of Eli's uncle buying part of the herd early, a fair negotiation with the bank that Jacob had apparently helped prepare by writing down all the arguments in his careful 8-year-old handwriting, and one anonymous payment that showed up applied to the account with no name attached. Clara had not told Eli that she'd written to a friend of Thomas's, a man who'd owed Thomas a debt of honor and had been waiting for a way to settle it. She hadn't told him. She'd just done it. When Eli figured it out, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking at her. "Stubborn," he said. "You mentioned," she said, without looking up from the bread she was kneading. She heard him walk across the kitchen, felt him stop close behind her. "Clara," he said quietly. She turned. He was standing close, closer than he usually stood, and his eyes had that look again, the one that was slightly terrified and warm in equal measure. "I know this isn't the right time," he said, "and I know you've been through things that would break most people, and I know Hope is only 3 weeks old, and you've got your whole life ahead of you, and you don't owe me anything." "Eli," she said gently, "I'm trying to say something here." "I know what you're trying to say." He stopped. "Do you?" She looked at him. This quiet man who had stopped on a dusty street for a woman everyone else had looked past, who had held her hand through the hardest night of her life, who had stood on his own porch and told her cousin-in-law that she mattered. "I think I started falling in love with you the night you talked to me about horses," she said, "so that you'd have something to hold on to." He blinked. "You knew what I was doing?" "You weren't exactly subtle," she said softly. Something broke open in his face then, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. This strong, careful, closed-up man letting himself be seen. He took her hands. "I'd like to court you proper," he said, "if you'll let me. And I'd like someday, if it feels right to you, for this to be your home. Really your home. Yours and Hope's." "And Jacob's," she said. "He already thinks it is," Eli said, with the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen from him. He told Hope this morning that she was his sister, and she didn't argue. Clara laughed, the full real kind that she hadn't heard from herself in months. "Yes," she said. "Court me proper. Take your time. We're not going anywhere." 3 months later, on a quiet Saturday morning with the east pasture gold with early light, Eli Cade and Clara Hensley stood on the porch of the ranch with the preacher from town, and Jacob holding Hope in his arms with tremendous concentration, and they made quiet promises to each other that didn't need to be loud to be real. When the preacher was done, Jacob looked up with shining eyes and said, "Does that mean I can call her Mama now?" Clara looked at Jacob, this earnest, wonderful boy who had swept a room for her before he'd even met her, and she knelt down to his level with Hope balanced between them. "You can call me whatever feels true," she said. "Mama feels true," Jacob said simply. And just like that, in the gold morning light, on a porch that sagged a little on one side, in a town that had once left a woman alone on a bench, a family was made. Not from perfect circumstances, not from easy roads, but from one man who stopped when no one else would, and one woman who was brave enough to accept the hand that was offered, and 2 children who never doubted for a single moment that love was exactly this simple. Clara pressed her cheek to Jacob's hair and felt Eli's hand on her shoulder and Hope's small warmth between them, and she thought, "This is what I was looking for when I didn't have words for it. This is what home feels like." If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know. Leave a comment below and tell me what part moved you most. And if you're watching from somewhere special, whether that's your kitchen, your porch, your cozy chair at night, tell me where. This community is something beautiful, and you're a part of it. Subscribe so you never miss a story, because there are so many more to tell, and every single one of them believes in the same thing this one does. That love finds you when you least expect it, and it's always worth the wait.